Hello all, and this video is going to be a bit of a prelude in setting the stage for where Plato and Socrates are going to be coming from in their philosophical project. And so we begin really where we left off last time, with this binary really being set between the sophists and the philosophical inquiry towards truth. One, of course, in the case of the sophists, is one of emotions, and their invocation being used through rhetoric to invoke such a thing for certain results that the sophists may feel necessary. Whereas the philosophical journey of inquiry, of finding truth, of what we'll get into with epistemology being developed here, we see an inward journey. And so we're really asking, is there an alternative to giving up on knowledge for the sophist day with skepticism and the usage of rhetoric? Or could it be that the pre-Socratic search for knowledge could be refined, could be really fixed in a sort of photographic aperture to give us a more clear picture of really the speculation that the pre-Socratics have been giving us so far? And if so, what would be this method or theory of knowledge? And so we must have a methodology, really, is what Plato and Socrates are setting apart here, of knowledge itself, instead of just this speculation of just really guesswork on how the universe is and what is true within it. And so Plato, and then his later student, of course, Aristotle, pick up this task to create a method for knowledge, to really work out these philosophical problems and hang-ups that the pre-Socratics had in their own time, which was eventually picked apart by the rise of skepticism. So you have that binary really of, can we have a theory of knowledge? Can we really refine this into a methodology of some sorts towards universals? Or should we just give up on this project altogether and go to the likes of rhetoric or moral relativism? And so this is really the beginning of that philosophical project and concern for developing a theory of knowledge, or as we call epistemology. And so now I want to turn to Socrates himself. Socrates, while regarded as many of his contemporaries and eventually really leading to his demise, is largely regarded as just another sophist that the Greeks saw. But of course, philosophically, he is much different than the sophists. I know I've made that mention a couple times before that Socrates is actually the greatest sophist of all, and it is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment because, of course, Socrates has a very different way of going about the good life, if you will, or politics, or any of these philosophical questions, really. And so one of the methods and contributions that he's going to make is, of course, with the Socratic method. So Socrates is going to embark on this intellectual journey of cultivating not wealth or status, if you will, but one of the soul of people, and their success isn't in the externals, but more embedded into the actual internal yearning for truth, for living the good life as nature intended, to nurture the soul, if you will. But most of our knowledge of Socrates, as anyone who's probably watching this knows, but just to, in case there is someone who is truly being introduced to Socrates here, although I think that's very unlikely if you're on this channel. But nonetheless, most of our information of Socrates, most of our account is, of course, given to us through Plato. Because, of course, he had a great understanding of his teacher, of the Socratic method. And so there's very little that we actually know outside of the dialogues themselves about Socrates, because of course he never wrote anything down. And so by knowing thyself, this is of course the famous Socratic quote. It means much more than just the kind of way we see it culturally, almost in a pop culture sense of a sort of self-understanding, but actually understanding your conditions of who you really are, of your being, and how to go about continuing the process. To know thyself is kind of almost a starting point, really, for Socrates, because if you can establish, out of the wilderness, if you will, who you are, then you have much work to do, actually. You are trying to cultivate your soul. And so knowing yourself is kind of the starting point. It's kind of step one, if you will, I think. And so you're actually supposed to embark on the continuing process of the ascension and its care, and its really, I would say Socrates, actually, his prime concern of philosophy is actually the cultivation of the soul. And so in order to do this, one must think about truth and goodness and the virtues, the universals, if you will. And then now to introduce the text that we'll be going over for probably quite some time is, of course, Plato's Republic. And what is Plato's Republic main focus or theme is a question regarding justice. And of course the book begins with Socrates, Cephalus, and Thrasymachus. And early on in the text, which we'll go into more depth in the next video, Thrasymachus, of course, famously says that justice is the interest of the stronger. And when presented with this argument, Socrates then implores, of course, the Socratic method. And I think this conversation is really the carte blanche example, really, if you will, of the Socratic method, because he totally defeats Thrasymachus using this, and makes him blush, and leaves in a sort of shameful way, and really just shuts him up. Now, of course, in this discussion, in this example, Socrates is going to point out that, say someone that you don't really desire to have power does have the physical strength to overcome Thrasymachus's sort of way or establishment, if you will, such as the slaves in this case. If they are actually stronger and they can overthrow the rulers, which of course Socrates mainly is going to be focused in talking to people who do have status, very well established sophists such as Thrasymachus, who have positions and would rather not see a sort of uprising, if you will. But if it's in the interest of the stronger, then there is no ill will, if you will. And if the slave has the interest of overthrowing the tyranny that they're facing, then of course that is in their own interest and their will. And of course Thrasymachus says that that's not really what I mean, and he is forced to revise his premise and made to think through his propositions. And this is really what the goal of the Socratic method is to think through. Searching with questions and opening lines of thought in the Socratic method, if applied properly, and if we were to take that, of course, truth and epistemology is the way, then using the Socratic method, we will always be able to revise, to realign people's thoughts towards the actual truth, because we're going to be peeling away the paradoxes and contradictions and misguided notions throughout these dialogues here, because the truth is always out there. The truth is always ready to be inhabited. And one of the methods that is very important to understand that Socrates is going to use very often is going to be the use of analogy. Because if you're talking about universals, if you're talking about truth, if there's really a theory of knowledge out there, then you should be able to make a bunch of different associations or analogies, some of them stronger than others, of course, to the idea of something like a universal, where there's a strong correspondence to be made across different classes of different animals, if you will, of different beings. And so this means that, of course, dialogue is going to really be the way to find truth through the use of the Socratic method. And the dialogues, of course, revolve around the different virtues and questions of the truth. And, of course, in the case of Plato's Republic, of what is justice. But the way, of course, the dialogues go is through the dialectic, which is a very important, I think, precursor to try to get your head around if you're going to go into really any of these texts. So the dialectic, in etymology, dia actually as the proposition is of throughness, to think things through by probing discussion. So even in the name, you could say that the Socratic method here is to think things through, to finding consistencies or contradictions by questioning and following this sort of line of through the methodology to eventually lead to the truth through that dialectic. For Socrates, we are looking for the truth about moral ideas such as love or friendship or courage. These are, of course, all virtuous. And then if you look real quickly to what Socrates in the Apology, he talks about what it is to live a life of injustice without the truth, or how justice harbors the cultivation of the soul. And so what is good for the body, like exercise or medicine, as he says in his quote, good laws and justice are for the soul. And if we're going to go about this, of course, then we're going to need to understand the function of government. And Socrates is going to turn, of course, to the great leader Pericles, who, in his domestic case, as Socrates is going to point out, he ruled upon reason and virtue and was regarded domestically for being this great statesman who, quite frankly, acted like a philosopher king, as Socrates and Plato want to cultivate out of great people. But of course, his relationship to other states was far different. It wasn't about reason. It was towards the likes of the sophist power. And so Pericles, of course, kind of has that mixed bag of, on one hand, he is the statesman of the philosopher king, but in many other regards in his foreign policy, he is more in line with the sophist idea of power. And in fact, one of the arguments and famous ones with regards to justice is to benefit your friends and to harm your foes, which of course Socrates is going to pick apart as we get into. Pericles was both a sophist rhetorically in his government, as well as being interested in the truth, being objective and known in the nature of things. And so you can think again of that kind of binary, really, that we started in the beginning of this video, played out in a sort of political axiom with Pericles here, where he acts as both of a sort of sophist of an interest in power in his foreign policy, but also towards reason, truth, and being objective towards his own people. And that's what really Socrates has issue with regards to Pericles. But then, of course, he wants to turn to Homer, which, he's famous for criticizing for not actually having any sort of experience in actual statecraft, unlike with Pericles, who, of course, has a wealth of knowledge and experience with running a state, of running military strategy. Homer here is simply just a poet. He's a copycat. He, makes, these poems and kind of acts as if he has experience in any sort of military capacity, but the military capacity experience is only experienced through his own art. He is just simply a shadow image, if you will. He has created a world within a world through his art and is simply copying what he thinks an actual statecraft or military strategy should be, but it doesn't actually have any basis into the objective, real, nature attuned to world. And so this kind of brings in one of the things that I think kind of actually scares people away from Plato and Socrates in a lot of regards with how they feel about art. But I also think that it's important to actually understand why they felt that way about art and maybe brush up on whether or not this is actually, as often called, simply a sort of exertion of tyrannical force against potential adversaries, where you have something like the artist scene now, if you will, in the 21st century, who is kind of going against the establishment, if you will, and making you think outside the box of experiencing aesthetics that otherwise wouldn't be in the real world, if you will. But here we're seeing that, you're creating a foe of knowledge, really, of creating a copycat image where you yourself have no sort of experience or craftsmanship or techne, as we'll see in the Republic. And so the main critique aimed at the sophists or the artists will be the yearning for power or the creation of copycat images that leaves no realm to the actual truth or to discern between good and evil. That's sort of, again, moral relativism, and that labeling could be applied again to the sophists for Socrates here. And so this video is largely just a prelude, if you will, to what we're going to get into with the lessons and themes in the Republic. And I think it's important to kind of cross the T's and dot the I's, if you will, before you actually submerge yourself in this extremely intellectually wealthy text, as well as artistically even. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video and continue to watch and look into this text with me.